It is said that British statesman, twice Prime Minister and Conservative politician Benjamin Disraeli was the first one to say the phrase lies, damn lies, and statistics. Now, whoever said it first is of little importance. The fact that it survived to this day shows that there is some truth to it, even though the phrase is often used wrongly. Oftentimes, statistics are used to prove or disprove an argument, and oftentimes the statistics themselves appear to be correct. And in fact, oftentimes they are prima facie correct, in the sense that it is impossible for a regular person to disprove them. The operative word is methodology, or in plain English, the way in which a statistic was collected. And in this video, I'll show you 5 methods used by governments to lie with statistics. Let's explore. Hello everyone and welcome to the Freedom Alternative. Alright, so in this video I'll be at times excessively technocratic as we look into something that I called multiple times over the years by the name scientific lying, which is a very insidious way of lying precisely because it is very difficult to detect and even more difficult to refute. And sometimes refutation may not even be possible at all because the waters have been muddied permanently. So, 5 ways the governments lie to you through statistics. Number 1, life expectancy. Now this sounds innocuous, right? Why would governments lie about life expectancy? What could they possibly gain other than some PR points? Well, PR points may be enough, but it's not just that. Data on life expectancy is routinely used by agents of totalitarianism to advance totalitarian agendas and arguments in favor of bigger and bigger government to the explicit detriment of liberty. One such argument sounds like this: social democracies in Europe have a higher life expectancy because they have socialist healthcare as opposed to primitive USA. And lo and behold, if you check the stats, it does look like the level of social democracy does correlate with life expectancy. But is there a causal relation? So those who disagree with the argument go on to attack the lack of causal relation, or to point out that, for instance, the diet of Europeans is better than the Americans, or to point out that Finnish Americans or Swedish Americans in fact have an even higher life expectancy than Finns and Swedes living in Finland and Sweden respectively. Thus, the policies employed may not be connected whatsoever with this. All of that is fine and dandy, but few are willing to go even further and attack the statistic itself. And the reason is very simple. Attacking the statistic itself is tedious work, and it requires quite a bit of specific knowledge and the ability to do level 2 reasoning. In other words, it doesn't fit in a tweet, and it's not easy to put to audiences with the attention span of a jellyfish. But it is indeed. So, let's attack the statistic itself. As I was saying in the intro, the operative word is methodology, which is a fancy way of saying the method by which a statistic is collected and or generated. So, how do countries reach their reported numbers of life expectancy? Well, for starters, we have to clarify that what pundits call and the media call life expectancy, what they really mean is life expectancy at birth. Traditionally, the main drivers downwards of this statistical indicator are infant and child mortality. And from this we can derive another lie routinely told to the public, to this day actually. Namely that you would only be living up to the age of 40 if you had been born in the 1850s without the wonders of medicine. Of course, this is a lie. People who lived to the age of 40 in the 19th century could very well expect to live another 30 years, not significantly different from today. What depressed the overall life expectancy at birth in the 19th century was a higher child mortality rate, which, yes, it had quite a bit to do with serious diseases, but also had quite a bit to do with lifestyle and engineering innovations that hadn't occurred yet. Heck, indoor plumbing alone did more to lower childhood mortality rates than all of the medical profession in total in the last 300 years. But I digress. So, the lower the childhood and infant mortality, the higher the overall life expectancy, right? Okay, so what does infant mortality mean? Well, it's very young children dying, right? Of course, but a child dying means that the child was alive beforehand, right? So what does that mean? Now, you may think I'm being pedantic, but definitions are crucial. Because the indicator of life expectancy, as well as other indicators such as the total fertility rate, the natural growth rate or natural increase, and many other demographic indicators are all derived from a very concrete measurement called live births. So the definition of a live birth can skew statistics in an area or a country by quite a lot. And sometimes that is done without necessarily bad intention, but simply as a result of bureaucratic inertia or some other factors, including immeasurable ones such as culture. Anyway, so the American CDC has a very long and precise definition of what constitutes a live birth. The CDC says that a live birth is, quote, the complete expulsion or extraction from its mother of a product of human conception, irrespective of the duration of pregnancy, which after such expulsion or extraction breathes or shows any other evidence of life, such as beating of the heart, pulsation of the umbilical cord, or definite movement of voluntary muscles, whether or not the umbilical cord has been cut or the placenta is attached. Heartbeats are to be distinguished from transient cardiac contractions. Respirations are to be distinguished from fleeting respiratory efforts or gasps, unquote. Now, this definition was adopted in 1997 and it is used to this day, but on the same report, the CDC also notes that, quote, 48 of the registration areas use a definition of live birth that is very similar to this one, 5 areas use a shortened definition of live birth, and 4 registration areas have no formal definition of live birth, unquote. Imagine that. Even within the same country, the definition of such a foundational concept is not universally accepted. So, now I ask you, what value is there in comparing the life expectancy indicator in the United States as a whole with any other place on Earth if even within the United States the key indicator is not uniform? Of course, there is some relative value, but when pundits and politicians use these statistics, they never bring up this caveat. But wait, there's more. Now, while the CDC definition is pretty clear, that doesn't mean it is also the legal definition. It's not the CDC that generates the data because it's not the CDC that oversees the concrete action of live births. In theory, it's the hospitals, but even those don't manage the whole data set. In practice, for all intents and purposes, the data is managed by individual US states through the process called the US Standard Certificate of Live Birth Application Form, which either the parents or the institution in which a baby is born is supposed to file. Now, most US states mandate that the live birth be submitted to the register within 5 days of the live birth occurring. So in practice, this means that any baby that dies between the age of 1 minute and before the age of 5 days will not be counted in the statistic as an infant mortality, but as a stillbirth, and that's by law. And then there are some jurisdictions, such as Washington, D.C., where the 5-day mandate is more like a 365-day mandate. From the Code of District of Columbia, Section 7, paragraph 231.08, Article 9, quote, a report of live birth submitted after 5 days but within 1 year from the date of live birth shall be registered in the standard format of live birth reports in the manner prescribed in this section. The report shall not be marked or flagged as delayed, unquote. Translation: infant deaths under the age of 1 year can legally be counted as stillbirths and thus not affect the life expectancy statistics. And there is no penalty, at least not in Washington, D.C., for an institution delaying the filing of the report for up to 1 year. In practice, this means hospitals in particular, to avoid lawsuits, avoid filing the paperwork if a newborn needs an incubator and the newborn's viability is debatable. And the institutions stall the process until it becomes clear that the newborn will live. If in the meantime the newborn dies, the institutions may file it as a stillbirth unless the parents are knowledgeable loudmouths who know when to threaten a lawsuit. Other countries are not that generous with these limits. In Europe, hard limits vary between 3 and 30 days, though the punishment for not observing those limits are minuscule. For instance, in my backyard, the limits are as follows: 30 days from the date of birth for the child born alive and still alive, 3 days from the date of birth for the child born dead, 24 hours from the date of death for the child born alive that died within 30 days, and 30 days for a child found or a child abandoned by the mother in the hospital. So the limits are much more stringent than in the United States, but for those who disagree, the penalty is no more than $40 in an administrative fine, which is really nothing. And the rules that I just quoted from my backyard aren't much different in the rest of the European Union, which in practice leads to all sorts of weird artifacts depending on all sorts of factors that one wouldn't think of immediately, such as the generalized attitude towards abortion. In more pro-life places, statistics tend to show a higher infant mortality than less pro-life places. So, for instance, the highest infant mortality rate in the European Union is in Malta, where abortion is forbidden. Second highest is in Romania, where abortion is permitted but socially condemned. Third is Bulgaria, fourth is Slovakia, fifth is Luxembourg, which is the wealthiest place in Europe, and sixth is Croatia, where also abortion is socially condemned. The only thing that these places have in common is a generalized pro-life attitude, which translates into much more rigorous recording of every statistic, of every live birth and every dead child. Slovakia and Czechia are neighbors, and there isn't much economic difference between the two, and they used to be the same country until this morning in historical terms. But they do have very different child mortality statistics. One big difference between the two is the degree of religiosity. Czechia is a majority irreligious country, while Slovakia resembles Poland or Romania in terms of religiosity. In practice, this leads again, on average, to more attention being paid to the live births issue in Slovakia or Malta than in Czechia or Sweden. Also, keep in mind that the infant mortality rate is defined as the number of deaths of children under 1 year of age, expressed per 1,000 live births. So, deaths of infants that were never recorded in the first place as live births end up classified as stillbirths or something else, thus improving the statistical outlook in all key demographic indicators that are then used by politicians and pundits worldwide to sell one political philosophy or another and pretend to be data-driven. Also, the whole exercise is dubious given that many countries don't count at all the number of children killed through abortion on demand, thus ruining other statistical indicators too, such as the total fertility rate indicator. The total fertility rate is objectively going down in most countries of Europe, but the indicator is further depressed by the fact that abortion is never taken into account. Now, this is not a conspiracy necessarily. It simply would be too complicated to do that, and in Europe it may also breach some data protection laws. But the fact that this is not done is keenly exploited by political actors of both the left and the right. The right exploits it by advocating all sorts of supposedly family-friendly programs, while the left exploits it by advocating for limitless mass immigration. The reality, of course, is that the ability of the indigenous population to replace itself is not lower than 50 years ago. The ability. It chooses its choices. I mean, the native population chooses different. Its choices are driving the different outcome. But that's not a politically correct thing to say, neither with the left nor with the right. To accept that choice as a very legitimate one that free people are allowed to make would mean that the left would have to renounce their flagship programs, namely socialist institutionalized murder, otherwise known as single-payer healthcare, and centralized state pensions. And the right would have to revisit its program by coming back to social conservatism, which has been abandoned by many right-wing parties in Europe. So there's that. All right. Number 2. Unemployment. Now here, Europe is number 1 in the world with this. All governments of Europe lie about unemployment numbers, and it is done deliberately and in an institutionalized fashion. As a result, there are two ways by which the unemployment official statistics are wrong: the institutional, intentional one, and the unintentional one. The intentional one is basically the European model, which hides the real numbers behind various layers of bureaucratic complexity. The first layer is to only count as unemployed the people who voluntarily registered themselves through the process, through the unemployment bureaucracy, and those who receive some sort of unemployment benefits. This may have been good enough in times when unemployment benefits were generous, but in the current year, in many countries, such as my own, it's simply not worth the effort most of the time, especially given that one isn't entitled to unemployment benefits if one had, say, 2 part-time jobs. Even if one made a lot more than a full-time employee member of a union, that doesn't matter for the socialist states of Europe. The second layer is to also fudge the other indicator, namely the labor force participation rate, which is used in the United States whenever the official unemployment stats do not seem credible. Well, Europe fudges that number too through various so-called education schemes. In the past, this used to be openly acknowledged, but over the last 15 years or so, the European Commission and the national governments of Europe have done a pretty good job at obfuscating this fact and eliminating it from any report. So, for instance, a 1996 report from the International Labour Organization used to say, quote, "In industrialized countries, training and retraining programs directed toward the unemployed can often mask the true extent of joblessness," unquote. Such an open admission is simply impossible to find in newer documents. Meanwhile, the so-called retraining programs have been extended in ways unimaginable in 1996. Almost all countries of Europe have social programs that amount to effectively fake jobs paid for by the state, which officially lower the unemployment rate, of course. Also, the social programs meant to keep the youth busy while not actually working also do wonders on the unemployment stats. Even with those in place, though, Europe continues to be a deeply unfriendly place for young people, with skyrocketing youth unemployment numbers. But those official numbers are in fact lower than the real number. And again, all of this is done intentionally. The state does it with the full knowledge that this will end with different statistics than the reality, and that is the point of the whole exercise. And then there is the third way of fudging the unemployment statistics, namely to change the definition. Before 2008, those working 15 hours a week were counted as either underemployed or straight up unemployed. After 2008, the category underemployed disappeared from the headlines of official reports, and in many countries, such as the United Kingdom, the Netherlands, or Spain, it is not measured at all, or at least not accurately. This is great for governments, who can then say that their policies reduced unemployment, which, although that may sometimes be technically correct, it is nonetheless a misleading claim, given that the wider public, who doesn't have time to comb through long PDFs and statistics, the wider public understands something else from that claim. Alright, so these are the intentional ways. Then there are the unintentional ways. The United States is probably the only developed country that at least tries to avoid the unintentional fudging of the numbers. But in Europe, the labor laws and the collection of statistics is so complicated that it routinely ends up not capturing reality. Not to mention the fact that the legislation is sometimes outdated, which, by the way, also makes most of the labor statistics in the European Union straight up useless when they try to present trends that affect the entire EU or EU-wide trends. Some countries of Europe don't even have the legal option called self-employed. Or they do, but the bureaucratic process is excessively complicated. These didn't matter that much in 1996 or 1999, but matters quite a lot now when the ability to make money is quite global. But since Europe is a high-tax place, there isn't much incentives from those left out of the statistics to try to clarify things either. And as long as those are few in absolute numbers, the governments aren't in a rush either, since they already covered that statistical anomaly with the programs of scientific lying that I just discussed earlier. Translation: statistics related to unemployment in Europe are unadulterated garbage. They don't reflect reality at all. This is even worse when talking about statistics that try to show trends in overall employment in Europe. Those stats are absolutely worthless since they involve 30 plus different ways of collecting them and ever-changing definitions year to year. This reality is that means that we have no idea just how big unemployment in Europe is really. Nobody knows. Now, I said earlier that Europe is a high-tax place. But how high? Number 3, effective tax rate. If you look up on the internet, effective tax rate Europe, you will find a map like this, showing you that the top personal income tax in France is 55.4%, while in Hungary is at 15%. Now, I'm sure that my Hungarian friends are laughing out loud, rolling over the floor at this map. In fact, what this map and all the others show is the willingness of governments to lie about just how much they steal from their citizens, as taxation is, let us not forget, first-degree armed robbery and nothing less. To work around this, one would have to calculate something called the fiscal burden, which is an indicator that varies by jurisdiction and attempts to calculate the actual percentage of one's income going to the state. Of course, there is no central institution that does this for you because it is in the government's interest to lie as much as possible about just how much of a person's income they steal. So, for instance, such maps try to measure only the income tax while avoiding the discussion about the VAT, which is a tax levied almost everywhere on Earth, and the United States is the only developed country that doesn't levy it. So, Hungary may have a 15% income tax, but it also has the highest VAT in the world, standing at 27%. So, if I'm a Hungarian corporation and I sell you a service worth $100, you, the customers, have to pay me $127, and I have to give $27 to the Hungarian government. And then there's the issue called contributions, which don't exist in the United States, but exist everywhere else. Officially, the governments claim they're not taxes, but fees for services rendered. For the most part, that is a lie because the services are either non-existent or subpar, not to mention oftentimes not needed. Besides, if it's mandatory, then it's a tax, no matter how you look at it. The vast majority of Europeans are subjected to a 10 to 20% tax on their salary as a contribution for the healthcare system. Now, not all incomes are subjected to it, but all salaries are. Also, some countries adopted a ceiling, namely that the tax is waived after a certain income level due to protests from high earners who ended up paying in a month more than the premium for private health insurance for a whole year. Nevertheless, most people have one source of income, their salary. So most people are subjected to this fiscal burden too. Then you add the even higher burden, the pension so-called contribution. This also varies wildly by country. It's 16% of the gross salary in Belgium and France, and going as high as 33.5% in Hungary. Again, the highest in Europe. So once you add those, the fiscal burden in Hungary is no longer among the lowest, but in fact one of the highest in the world. I'm mentioning this for all the American right-wingers who idolize the Hungarian system. If Americans were subjected to the huge fiscal burden that Hungarians are, they would burn down the Capitol in Washington, D.C. every 3 months, and January 6th would finally be recognized for what it was, a peaceful walk in the park. Anyway, January 6th notwithstanding, the fact of the matter is that all countries of Europe lie about the fiscal burden that they impose upon their citizens. And it's basically up to you to look up every law and add up all the taxes and come up with the numbers yourself. So for instance, in my country, the government insisted that salaried workers were taxed to only 16%. And they insisted that between 2004 and 2014 or so. The real tax burden was about 48%. Multiple lawsuits from self-employed people and small businesses have forced the government to lower the effective burden and also to openly acknowledge it. Ish. Today, most sources will tell you that the actual tax burden for a salaryman in Romania is 41.5%. But even that figure is incomplete because, again, it doesn't include the VAT, which is 19%, except for medical products, restaurants, water delivery, and some fertilizers, for which I think it's 9%. And then there's also books, hotels, museums, social housing, and a few other things, traditional food, I think, for which the VAT is 5%. Then, of course, you have to add the property taxes, which affect almost everyone in Romania, since Romania has the highest home ownership rate in the world. Then you have to also add excise taxes, which affect 100% of the people, since they are not only applied to alcohol and tobacco, but also to energy products, including gas, and some other so-called parafiscal fees should also be added to this, such as the fee to replace your ID, which is mandatory, to replace your passport, notary fees when fixing inheritance, and so on and so forth. So once you add these ones too, the actual fiscal burden for a salaryman is about 62% in Romania. And believe it or not, this is considered low by EU standards. Of course, by my standards, this is armed robbery, which is why I'm explicitly advocating for tax evasion, which I consider it to be a legitimate self-defense. Now, the benefits for governments for lying about their actual fiscal burden are enormous. The governments in Eastern Europe lie so they can attract investment by selling their jurisdictions as low tax. And to be fair, for bigger investors, the current fiscal codes in most of the Intermarium is quite friendly. But that doesn't change the fact that the fiscal burden on regular people is enormous, and just because West Europe is even crazier doesn't change the fact that things are pretty damn crazy here too. By comparison, the total fiscal burden in the United States is about 40%, and that's for people in California. Most Americans are subjected to a fiscal burden somewhere in the vicinity of 30%. And they still complain about being taxed too much, and they are, of course, correct to complain. But even funnier are the rich paysans from the United States who advocate a European system for the United States, yet they'd never be subjected to such a brutal regime that the peoples of Europe are subjected to. Not to mention many of them don't even know what is the real fiscal burden in Europe anyway. So yeah, next time you see statistics comparing taxes between countries, please do keep in mind that they're very likely bullshit. Okay? Number 4. All COVID stats. I don't think I need to go through this again. Not a single statistic related to COVID is correct. None. They're all wrong. Some of that, of course, was intentional. But a lot of it was simply the result of reality refusing to conform to laboratory and academic expectations. So, for instance, do masks work? Well, depends on what you mean by work. Yet for 2 years, discussion about methodology was labeled a far-right conspiracy. Why? Because the pushers of the pandemic project knew very well that the whole house of cards collapses at any serious scrutiny. I mean, this is the graph with evolution of the Wuhan flu in Romania between March 2020 and November 2022, when the owner of the website, a militant branch Covidian, stopped making graphs because of people like me. Can you point on this graph when there was a mask mandate in place and when there wasn't? I'll let you cheat and tell you that there was a mask mandate throughout the entire period. Similarly, do the shots work? Again, depends on what you mean by work. If you mean increasing the incidence of cardiopathies among young men, then of course they work. But if you mean decreasing the incidence of the Wuhan flu at the population level, I don't know. They probably don't, but we don't know. But for years you didn't know that, because the methodology of the statistics was kept hush-hush. Same goes for every single COVID statistics published by any government anywhere. The COVID deaths, same thing. Motorbike accidents, construction accidents, and even suicides were included in COVID death statistics. It's all wrong to a significant degree as to render the whole statistic useless. The debate should be to what extent the wrong was intentional, because to debate if any of them were true is simply a waste of time. The entirety of the collection methodology that led to any COVID statistic was flawed right from the get-go. That's why I'm interested in separating good faith mistakes from evil intent, because it's really all that matters in order to establish the degree of punishment, of course. So yeah, I won't go again through all of that, but do keep in mind that the pandemic project is a very good example to use when discussing with normies about how governments lie through statistics. And finally, number 5, crime rate statistics. Now, in fairness, some of this is not intentional. The most obvious example of intentional lying that I'm aware of is South Africa. There, the murder rate is horrendously high, a bit over 33 per 100,000 residents. To put this into perspective, Chicago at 28 murders per 100,000 is, comparatively speaking, a safe city. But that number is lower than reality. If you look up on the internet, you will find stories about how the murder rate in South Africa, while still high, has been decreasing since its peaks in 2010 and 2011. Now that may be true, but the decrease is not that spectacular as the official stats show it. You see, the murder rate is not recorded like in Europe. If you get attacked, let's say stabbed on the street, you get rushed to the hospital and die 3 days later due to the wounds. Well, that counts as murder in Europe, but not in South Africa. In South Africa, that counts as death under medical care. Only those found already dead at the scene are counted as victims of murder. That's how it is possible to see the overall death rate still climbing after 2011, while the murder rate appears to be stable. As of 2023, however, even that is no longer enough to hide the ugly truth. But it worked for a few years. It brought the regime some silence and some peace with the opposition. Great opportunity to steal some more and continue the overall downward spiral of the country. So there's that. It worked. But there are many other, let's call them less egregious examples. For instance, in the United States, lying about crime statistics is a staple of basic politics. In the early 2000s, it was the Republicans who routinely lied about crime statistics. In the current year, it is the Democrats who routinely lie and or misrepresent the crime statistics. I'll leave in the description link a link to an NAACP Legal Defense Fund report that is a huge, well, actually kind of blog post trying to excuse away the horrendous spike in murders, armed robbery, and other violent crimes overwhelmingly committed by the 1352s and explicitly enabled by Soros-funded district attorneys who refuse to prosecute or intentionally misprosecute to avoid getting a conviction, thus consistently leaving dangerous offenders loose on the streets of American cities. The entire report is a great example of how to lie with statistics, even if the stats themselves are correct, because at least murders are still counted accurately in the United States of America. In Europe, fudging the stats in violent crime is a matter of routine in Germany, the United Kingdom, or the Netherlands. Every time some diversity goes on a killing or raping rampage in a German city, and it happens a lot, the police is very happy to classify it as a psychiatric condition, which results in it never being counted as intentional crime. In the UK, it's even easier. Crimes committed by diversity are routinely never prosecuted to begin with, so legally, they don't exist. To make things worse, even though the biggest danger by far is Islamic terrorism, British agencies are politically forced to be focused on right-wing terrorism, which is next to non-existent in the United Kingdom. This also leads to misallocation of resources, and in the end, that is also reflected in the crime stats. The Netherlands is a violent narco-state comparable to Mexico. The issue is so out of hand that you have mafia-style assassinations in broad daylight, and the country's princess is studying online because it's not safe for her to actually go to classes. Of course, you wouldn't know that from the media because most of the perpetrators are Moroccan, therefore diversity, therefore shut up, you far-right bigot, and stop talking about it. What are you, a Putinist? Which is even funnier, given that one of the most Putinist regimes in Europe, after Germany of course, is precisely Mr. Mark Reute's regime. But hey, what do I know? I'm just a guy on the sofa who's been discussing Russian infiltration about 7 years before it became fashionable to do so. Anyway, long story short, when looking at crime statistics, do make sure to check out the methodology. Usually crime stats are a bit more honest than other examples in this video, but the discussion around them usually isn't. So yeah, that's all I had to say on this topic. And I know I made another video about this topic about 3 years ago, but that one was focused on narrative spin, and I thought I'd also explain how things go wrong even before reaching the point where pundits spin as statistics. Oftentimes the statistic itself is wrong, thus all debates derived from it are muddied before they even start. So keep that in mind all the time, and always ask about the methodology, always, regardless of whether the statistic fits your biases or not. And with all that being said, thank you all for watching, thank you for your consistent and generous financial support. Don't forget to subscribe, visit our website, and if you like what we do, consider becoming a member of the donor circle. And with that, I will see you all soon on the Freedom Alternative.